morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Ding and the Quiz is Done. Today we are moving into the last phase of the topic on the Normans, where we look at the reform of the church by the Normans. Now, before we do this, because again I forgot last time, pause the video and do the quiz. Okay, so in today's lesson we're not going to have a look at Norman reform yet. Instead, I want us to have a look at the church in the 11th century, and specifically why the church was important. This is something which is drastically different to today's society, where religion has got less of an important place, at least in the running of countries. So we need to put ourselves in the mindset of people in the 11th century before we can explain why reform of that organisation was so important. So that's the question we're going to be answering, or the task we're going to be doing today, explain the importance of the church in 11th century England. To do that, we're going to have a look at religion in Europe during this period, we're going to have a look at the structure of the church, and then we're going to have a look at why the church was important, but also specifically why the church was important to William and the Normans in England in the late 11th century. So this is a map that I've already shown you. I showed it to you when we were doing Islamic and Christian influence on medicine, when we were looking at Britain, Health and the People way back at the beginning of year 10. Now, at this point in time, the vast majority of Western Europe was Catholic and was influenced by the Pope in Rome. We also have Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe, and then towards the south and bordering on a little bit with Spain, we've got Islam, but we're mainly focusing on Christianity. In fact, we are focusing on Christianity today. And Christianity in this period of time did have a very, very specific hierarchy to it. Please excuse those still being there and those being in Comic Sans. I have no idea why. So within each country, at the absolute ground level, you would have priests, and priests would be the people in towns, in villages, seeing ordinary people in the day-to-day. They're going to be people performing baptisms, funerals, weddings. They're going to be providing a certain amount of very, very basic medical care. An area would then be run by a bishop, so priests run a small area called a parish. A group of parishes then forms what's called a diocese, which is run by a bishop, and then a group of dioceses is called an archdiocese, and funnily enough, it's run by an archbishop, and that's going to be the full structure within one country. I'm going to talk about this section with our abbots and monks in a second, but that's the basic structure within one country. And then at the top of all of this, you would have the Pope. Now, it's really, really important to remember that there is one Pope in the world. I mean, there was a point when there was two, but there shouldn't have been two, and that's a whole other story. But you don't have popes per country, you have popes for the entire Catholic religion. And in England at this period of time, there are two archbishops. There was the Archbishop of York and there was the Archbishop of Canterbury, because there was a bit of a split between the English Church, which does get resolved, and eventually there's only one Archbishop, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the modern day head of the Church of England. Now, we also have this little branch here, which is our monks and abbots. Now, the reason why this is separate to our priests and bishops is because these are individuals who don't regularly have contact with everyday people. Their job is not to serve the community. They are people living in monasteries. If they're women, they're nuns. They're living in nunneries or abbeys. And these are people who have separated themselves from society in order to live a life dedicated to God. We're going to spend a couple of lessons purely looking at those individuals. So at the moment, you just need to know that they're there, and you need to know how they fit within the hierarchy. But the important thing to note here is that the structure in England kind of cuts off there with our archbishops. Now, it is a very strict structure. However, at the same time, archbishops also run their country and are not always under supervision by the Pope. If you think about even the modern day, or within the structure of our school, I suppose I would be an archbishop in this situation and Mr. Wells would be the Pope. I rule, with inverted commas, E-wing, FE-wing on his behalf. Now, even then, even though I follow Mr. Wells's directions, Mr. Wells doesn't spend every waking moment checking up on me and making sure I'm doing as he asks. He trusts me to do it. And if I wanted to, which I don't, I could choose to disobey his instructions. I could choose to try and separate myself off a little bit. Because I'm not under that direct supervision, I would be sanctioned for it, but I do have that freedom to do that. It's important to note that that is also possible in 11th century England with the church, that these archbishops can choose to move away or disobey the Pope and kind of deal with the consequences. So that's the basic structure. What we now need to do is do some reading about why the church was so important. So, our keywords for today: if something is mutually beneficial, it is describing a situation in which both sides of an arrangement depend on each other but also gain something from each other as a result. So, I'm depending on you to do this, you're depending on me to do this, but we both get something out of it. Autonomy is the freedom to make your own decisions. To excommunicate someone is to officially exclude someone from the Catholic Church. That means that when they die, they're definitely not going to heaven. And an abbot is the male leader of a closed Christian community. An abbey, an abbess, would be the female leader of an abbey. Okay, so have something to track so you can read along with me. Most people in Europe in the 11th century were Christian. They believed that, so long as they followed the instructions of the church and the teachings of the Bible, they would go to heaven when they died. If they did not do so, they believed they would go to hell. People looked to the church for guidance and approval, especially as many people could not read. This is a really, really good example of a demonstration that most people couldn't read. This is called a doom painting, which would appear in many churches during this period. This particular doom painting shows the joys of heaven and the horrors of hell. European rulers had a mutually beneficial relationship with the Pope. Rulers agreed to follow the Pope's instructions and to recognise a certain amount of autonomy for the Church in their countries. In return, the Pope would legitimise a ruler's claim to the throne and support them in times of war. In 1066, the Pope showed his support for William's invasion of England by providing him with a papal banner. In return, William promised to reform the Church in line with the Pope's wishes. If rulers disobeyed or displeased the Pope could put pressure on them by supporting foreign invasions, by stopping religious ceremonies in their countries, or by excommunicating them. So we've seen this word legitimise before, which means to make something look right or look justified. And actually there's an excellent example that we're going to talk about with William. Not only did the Pope provide the papal banner during the Battle of Hastings, but in 1070 he sent a group of representatives to England who re-crowned William, and that's a really good example of that legitimising of a king through religion. The Church in individual countries also had the ability to influence the decision of rulers. Leading members of the Church advised rulers on important decisions. Archbishops, bishops, and even abbots and abbesses served on the Witan and later the Curia Regis. This influence extended to laws. The Church had the power to try people who had committed crimes on Church lands in their own courts. Members of the Church, such as priests or bishops, were also tried by the Church rather than by the King's court. Church courts had the same power as the king and could hand down justice in his name. So imagine a situation in which I was able to say something. Let's think about it with the house system. So let's say that somebody did something in my lesson that I didn't like, and I was going to send them to reflection. I'd given them a warning and they'd continued doing whatever it was. And just as I did that, just as I said, okay, that's it, you're going to go to isolation, suddenly Miss Dominy appears out of nowhere and says, aha, I'm sorry, Miss Sayers, I'm afraid that that student is in Aquila. And because that student's in Aquila, it's my responsibility to determine what should happen with them. And it's actually my responsibility to determine whether they did anything at all. And in my opinion, it wasn't that bad. So we're just going to give them a little slap on the wrist and we're going to let them carry on. And that student stays in my class and I'm powerless to do anything. That's the kind of situation that many rulers found themselves in, because churches had the ability to try people on church land, but also to try members of the church with the power of the king. That often meant that the king was kind of pushed to one side because the church had the ability to punish people instead. The church was also extremely wealthy. In England in the 11th century, the church held roughly 20% of all the land in England. Not only were people required to work this land for free, but they were also required to pay 10% of all of their income to the church in a tax called the tithe. Many wealthy landowners also chose to donate large sums to monasteries or abbeys to secure their place in the afterlife. In 1070, William the Conqueror established Battle Abbey to earn forgiveness for bloodshed at the Battle of Hastings, and that's Battle Abbey in the modern day. And remember, when we talk about this idea of land, this links to potentially military power if needed. The church rarely raised its own armies, but it could do when required. Really, really good example of this, and members of the church getting involved in military conflicts is Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who we've seen a couple of times before. Now, he wasn't allowed to shed blood in the Battle of Hastings, and so he just carried a club, and he was allowed to apparently bash people's heads in. So you can see him in the Bayeux tapestry. He's the one on a horse carrying a club, and I will put a photo of him in now. Okay, so that's our summary of why the church was important. Funnily enough, what I would now like you to do is I'd like you to do a spider diagram. Now, when you do that, I want you to do or to focus on the method that we were using last lesson, where we didn't just say individual words, we used this as an opportunity to start building up possible chains of reasoning. Now, when you do this, I also want you to have a look, I want you to theme these reasons for importance. So I'm going to do one to show you what I mean. Let's have a look at my examples. Okay, let's start with this idea of religious pressure. And I would theme everything around that word pressure. Okay, so people believed in God, heaven, hell, etc. That leads to fear of punishment. That means that rulers would obey for fear of going to hell. Obey the church / the Pope. So you can see I'm building up that chain throughout. Okay, so pause your video and then fill in your spider diagram. Okay, as always, I don't really want to do the entire sheet again, having already done it once. So just let me hide these answers. And then we'll put them up on the screen. Okay, so we've already spoken about religious pressure. Rulers would obey the church in order to avoid being punished in the afterlife. Next up, military pressure. This really closely links to what we were talking about in the reading. Because the church owned roughly 20% of the land in England, they had wealth and land that could be used to raise an army, either through the people who worked their land, or they could pay mercenaries. Mercenaries are essentially soldiers who don't work for a particular country. You just pay them and they will fight. And that could then be used to rebel against the king. Excellent example of this, again, is good old Bishop Odo of Bayeux, and in fact he does end up rebelling against the king, and I believe he was exiled for it, which we're going to look at later in this topic. Next up then, political pressure. So the king doesn't make decisions on his own, he is ultimately the one who makes the decision. However, he would make that decision off the back of advice from different people, and most of the people actually who were giving the king advice were important members of the church. So archbishops, bishops, abbots and abbesses. Bishop Odo was another one of those people on the Curia Regis giving the king advice. And that meant that the church could basically sway the king or try and nudge the king in favour of decisions that would benefit the church. Political pressure. So this links up to that idea of religious pressure. It all kind of leans on religious pressure. The reason why the church has wealth is because people are willing to donate money to it or pay the tithe or work the church's land for free because they think if they don't, they'll go to hell. The reason why there is religious pressure there is because people believe in it, and the reason why there's political pressure is because people believe that if they don't obey the church, then they will be punished, and that as a result of that, the church could use that influence, the Pope could use that influence, so that if somebody disobeyed the Pope or disobeyed the church, then the Pope could encourage other rulers to invade the country, or they could attack the countries of disobedient rulers. Now, there is evidence that there was some reform taking place in the English church before 1066, but it was mostly in the time of Canute. When Edward was in power, the Archbishop of Canterbury was a man called Stigand, and Stigand wasn't really interested in reforming and changing the church to be in line with what the Pope wanted. This is one of the reasons why William was supported with the papal banner, because William promised to introduce the reforms that the Pope had wanted and the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time hadn't introduced. So again, you can use William and the papal banner as a really good example of that, but you would need to explain why the Pope was willing to support William and how that links to, in this case, a disobedient Archbishop of Canterbury. And finally, legal pressure. The church could undermine the king's laws in the church courts. So similar to what I said with Miss Dominy coming into my room and undermining me and making myself look less powerful. If the church didn't agree with a law or simply didn't want a law to affect them, then they did have the ability to undermine it because they had power over the church courts. So we've got 5 possible chains of reasoning there. You would only need to do 2. Now, as always, my advice is to pick chains of reasoning for which you have specific examples. Don't pick the one that you don't have anything to back it up with, because you're not demonstrating your excellent writing and your ability to support your argument. So where you've got a concrete example, where you've got concrete figures that can prove that you're right, use that chain of reasoning. Because, funnily enough, we're going to answer that question. Explain the importance of the church in 11th century England. Now, you can see I have got a model down the bottom, but I'm going to save that for our feedback lesson, which will probably be next week now. So this should be 2 paragraphs. It should take you 10 minutes. You should be explaining 2 of those chains of reasoning, and I can't emphasize this enough. This would be in great big red bold letters, underlined and boxed if it was in one of my lessons. You have to support your chains of reasoning with specific facts. It's not knowledge vomit if you're proving yourself right. Okay, once you've written that, send it over to me and I will send you some feedback. Okay, have a nice day and I'll see you next time.